In the heart of Istanbul, nestled behind the grand courtyards and gilded gates of Topkapi Palace, a hidden world pulsed with quiet pain and golden silence. It was not the halls of viziers or the quarters of concubines that carried this haunting stillness, but the forgotten rooms of the cafes, the cage, where Ottoman princes, stripped of their titles, lived their lives in a velvet-lined prison. The world knew them as potential heirs, but the palace had already decided their fate. They would never rule. These were the forgotten boys of the Ottoman Palace, brothers, sons, uncles of sultans, sacrificed at the altar of dynastic security. For centuries, the Ottoman throne stood on the razor's edge of power and paranoia. After violent fratricide was officially outlawed in the early 17th century, the sultans adopted a more refined cruelty: confinement. Young princes, many of them mere toddlers when brought to the palace, were tucked away in secluded chambers as soon as a new sultan took the throne. The idea was simple. If no brother could claim the throne, no brother could spark a civil war. But the price was unimaginable. No sunlight, no education, no contact with the outside world. They were raised like birds in a golden cage, watched over by eunuchs and whispered about in the palace corridors. Mehmed, one such boy, arrived at the palace when he was just 4 years old. The guards carried him from his mother's arms in the dead of night, her cries muffled by the swirling veils of the harem. His father, the late Prince Selim, had died of poisoning. Perhaps political, perhaps not. And Mehmed's presence was deemed a threat to the reigning sultan. He was led through narrow passages, past towering silks and perfumed fountains, and finally into a small suite of rooms with no windows and velvet walls. That would be his kingdom now. That was his world. At first, Mehmed cried every day. His voice echoed through the thick walls like a forgotten call to prayer. But over time, the crying stopped. Not because the pain had faded, but because his voice simply gave up. The silence became his lullaby. His toys were carved from soft wood, his books censored, his food slipped in through hidden panels. The eunuchs, loyal, sterile, and emotionless, never spoke unless needed. Mehmed's only companions were the paintings on the walls and the pigeons he could sometimes hear cooing outside. There were others in the cage with him. Ahmed, older by 6 years, whispered to him through a hole in the wooden divider. Ahmed had been there since he was 8. Now 14, he spoke of life outside the palace like a story from another world. The Bosphorus, he'd murmur in the dark, smells like salt and lilacs in spring. Mehmed had never smelled salt. He didn't know what a lilac looked like. But Ahmed's voice was a lifeline. They were prisoners of protocol, not crime. Their only sin was royal blood. Every morning they were made to dress in silks. Every evening they were taught calligraphy. But their lessons were hollow, and their smiles manufactured. The Ottomans feared rebellion more than ignorance, so their education was limited to art and language, never politics or leadership. Their rooms had no sharp edges, no hard tools, only cushions and ink pots and scented oils. Mehmed sometimes imagined himself as a puppet, hung on a wall of silence, his strings cut one by one with each passing year. The eunuchs, though silent, had their own hierarchy. Chief among them was Qasim Agha, an aged black eunuch who had served 4 sultans and guarded the cage with the devotion of a man married to his duty. He had seen boys grow mad from confinement, clawing at their velvet walls or speaking to shadows. He had seen boys die of illness without ever being held. And sometimes when the palace shifted its loyalties, he saw boys taken from the cage at dawn, never to return. He never said where they went. He never had to. The silence spoke loud enough. One stormy night, Mehmed woke to screams. Not loud, but muffled, urgent. He crept to the divider, calling softly for Ahmed. No reply. The next morning, the eunuch said Ahmed had gone to the bathhouse. But Mehmed knew. There was no bathhouse visit at midnight. The screams still echoed in his skull. The next week, a new boy arrived. Pale, trembling, barely able to speak. His name was Orhan. His crime, being the cousin of the Sultan's newborn son. Time in the cage was strange. Days were marked by meals and candlelight. Months were marked by whispers of executions. Years were marked by the arrival and disappearance of new boys. Mehmed grew into adolescence without once seeing the sun. He learned to memorize the faces of shadows, to tell the time by the rhythm of footsteps. His body changed, but no one acknowledged it. His mind grew hungry, but it was fed only poetry and obedience. When he turned 12, he asked Qasim Aga why they were here. Qasim only replied, "Because you were born a possibility." In the outside world, revolts brewed, wars ignited, and borders shifted. But inside the palace, the forgotten boys remained unchanged. Mehmed once heard the court musicians playing for the Sultan's wedding. He pressed his ear to the wall, imagining the colors, the dancers, the candles glowing in golden mirrors. For a moment, he imagined himself there, dressed in princely robes, holding a goblet, laughing like the other sons of the empire. But then a guard passed, and he shrank back into the shadows. Dreams were dangerous here. When Mehmed was 15, a new edict came from the divan. One of the princes in the cage would be evaluated for suitability. The Sultan, paranoid and childless, considered lifting one boy into public life. It was the first time in years that the cage opened not for death, but for potential. Whispers spread like fire. Boys practiced their posture. They quoted poetry. They cried in private. Mehmed's heart beat with a hope he didn't understand. Maybe, just maybe, there was a door out of this darkness. Qasim Aga tested them, not with questions but with observation. Who kept their composure? Who obeyed commands? Who showed loyalty without ambition? Mehmed knew the game. You had to look like a prince, but not act like a threat. Speak like a poet, but never like a leader. Smile just enough to be liked, but never enough to look eager. It was like trying to balance on a sword's edge. For weeks, the palace held its breath. Finally, one morning, the guards entered Mehmed's room. His heart stopped. He thought they had come to take him away like Ahmed, but instead, they bowed. For the first time in 11 years, someone bowed to him. "The Sultan wishes to see you," they said. His knees weakened. His vision blurred. As they led him out of the velvet cage, past corridors he had never walked, Mehmed felt as if he had been reborn. The light stung his eyes. The sense overwhelmed him. The silence broke. But in the grand hall where the Sultan waited, things were not as they seemed. The air was cold, not with temperature, but with purpose. The Sultan, gaunt and heavily guarded, studied Mehmed like a chess piece. "You have survived the cage," he said. "Now let us see if you survive the court." Mehmed didn't know whether to kneel or stand. His voice trembled as he whispered, "Yes, my lord." And with that, the door to another prison quietly clicked shut behind him. The air in the Sultan's court was heavy with incense and invisible tension. Mehmed stood still as a marble statue, barely breathing. His entire body ached under the weight of silk robes, not from discomfort, but from expectation. He was no longer the voiceless boy of the cage. He was now being watched by everyone. Viziers, spies, guards, servants, all measured him for loyalty, weakness, ambition. The Sultan had brought him out of the shadows not out of kindness, but to test him. And if he failed the test, he would vanish like Ahmed had, no questions asked. The days that followed were a whirlwind of ceremonies and silence. Mehmed was taught again how to walk, how to bow, how to speak in metaphors and riddles. He was given advisors, men who watched him more than they taught. Every smile was rehearsed, every word weighed. He was presented at a royal banquet, not to enjoy the feast, but to be paraded like a tamed animal in front of nobles and foreign ambassadors. They called him Prince Mehmed, but he felt more like a decoration carved from fear and desperation. He was warned, subtly, never to speak about the cafes. The cage, they said, was a necessary measure, a sacred custom that preserved the empire. "Do not shame the tradition that preserved your life," one vizier whispered. Mehmed wanted to scream. Shame? It had stolen his voice, his memories, his very soul. But he smiled, as they expected him to. After all, he was still surviving, and in the Ottoman Palace, survival was its own kind of rebellion. Weeks turned into months, and Mehmed became a favorite of the court, respected for his poetic restraint, admired for his quiet wisdom. But he was also feared, not for what he might do, but for what he represented. A caged prince let loose was like a caged tiger taught to purr. Nobody trusted the silence in his eyes, least of all the Sultan. Mehmed noticed it one evening when the Sultan gripped his goblet tighter every time Mehmed laughed. The jealousy was subtle, but lethal. There was talk now, talk that the Sultan, still without a male heir, might name Mehmed as his successor. It was dangerous talk. Whispers carried through gardens, echoed in marble halls, wrapped around pillars like poisonous vines. Mehmed heard them all. He learned to pretend he didn't. He spent hours in the palace library, poring over histories of sultans who rose and fell on the whims of power. The stories taught him the truth. The closer you get to the throne, the closer you get to the edge of a sword. Then one morning he received a letter. Not from the court, not from any official. It was tucked inside a book in the library, written in trembling ink. "They are watching you," it said. "Remember Ahmed." No name, no signature. But Mehmed knew the handwriting. It belonged to Qasim Aga, the same eunuch who had once watched over him, fed him in silence, stared at him with stone eyes. Why warn him now? Why break the palace code of silence? Mehmed understood only later that it wasn't kindness. It was conscience. Qasim had guarded dozens of boys like him. Some went mad. Some died. Mehmed had survived, and now stood at the mouth of the very machine that had once chewed his childhood. Qasim's note was not an invitation to run. It was a final prayer. And Mehmed knew then, freedom in this palace was just another illusion. The cage never truly ends. It only changes shape. Soon, a marriage was arranged. The Sultan ordered Mehmed to wed the daughter of a loyal vizier, an act of cementing alliances. The girl, Hurrem, was beautiful but unreadable. Her eyes studied Mehmed the way soldiers study maps. She, too, was a prisoner of appearances. Mehmed married her with grace. He smiled. He kissed her hand. But their wedding night was a cold performance, watched over by silent servants and paranoid eyes. Even love here was staged. Even intimacy was protocol. Still, Hurrem surprised him. She was intelligent, shrewd, and perhaps more trapped than he was. One night, in a rare whisper beneath silk sheets, she said, "They're preparing your coffin, my prince. It's just lined with gold." Her words chilled him more than the stone floors of the palace. She explained the truth. The Sultan would never allow a younger, beloved prince to overshadow his fading reign. Mehmed was not a successor. He was a scapegoat waiting for a scandal. A plan formed in Mehmed's mind. He could not run, he could not fight, but he could outlive them all. He began to play the game more carefully. He praised the Sultan in public. He wept at state funerals. He built schools, funded poets, gave to the poor. The people began to chant his name in the streets, not as a rebel, as a symbol of forgotten honor. The Sultan smiled with poison in his teeth. This boy was now a threat, not with swords, but with stories. Then came the order. Mehmed was summoned at night to the Sultan's chamber. It was the same way Ahmed had been taken. Mehmed prepared his soul. He dressed in white. When he arrived, the Sultan was alone, sickly, trembling, holding a glass of rose water. "You remind me of my brother," the Sultan said, voice brittle. "He too was admired. He too had to be silenced." Mehmed said nothing. He only knelt, offering his neck. It was a gesture from centuries past, when brothers killed brothers by hand. But the Sultan only laughed. "No, no, not yet." Instead of death, Mehmed was sent away to govern a remote province near the empire's edge. It was exile masked as promotion. There, far from the center of power, Mehmed lived in uneasy peace. He ruled fairly, built mosques, raised a son. But he never returned to Istanbul. He knew that if he did, it would be in a coffin, draped in silence. Years passed. The Sultan died. A new ruler took the throne, but Mehmed was never recalled. The cage had followed him to the provinces, less gilded now, more rural but still confining. His son asked him once, "Father, were you ever in the palace?" Mehmed stared at the horizon and said, "I lived in its silence." When Mehmed died in his 50s, they buried him without ceremony. The empire had forgotten his name long ago. But in Topkapi Palace, in the dim halls of the old cage, his name was still carved into the wooden beams of the room he once called home. Mehmed, son of Selim, the boy who remembered. His story, like so many others, was never recorded in the royal chronicles. No historian sang his deeds, no poet wrote his elegy. But if you walk through the palace today in the quietest wing, past the faded silks and ghost-filled halls, you'll find a locked chamber. Inside it, the shadows still whisper. The boys are still waiting, forgotten by time, remembered by the walls.